That's cool. Yeah. Appreciate the reminder, Russ.
Me too. Okay, we ready? Okay, well, welcome and thank you all for coming tonight. This is Mark Tiedemann and John Lowrance. Mark is a science fiction writer, and also he's writing mysteries now too, right? Am I correct on that? Or
I'm making an attempt.
okay, making an attempt. I think he's the author of 12 books and many short stories, and he has been nominated for a number of prestigious national awards, so we're happy to have him here. John Lowrance is a long time public librarian, high school librarian,
Right.
Science fiction, how do I put it? He's so knowledgeable, amazing collections.
Connoisseur.
Connoisseur to be sure. Both are widely read, and it's just happy to have him here. I want to read one thing that I was listening to an interview that of Mark today on YouTube, and this I had to write this down. I thought it was so taken with it. And he says, "I look around at the world and cannot help but feel that if more people simply read more and more widely, things would begin to resolve. Never before have we had it thrown in our faces with such force, the cost of ignorance." So anyway, so we're going to talk about
True that.
yes.
True that.
Yeah, so they're going to talk about trends in science fiction today and just, science fiction publishing in general. And we open it up to questions too. So
Right. So it began a long time ago, science fiction, in terms of its publication, but it didn't really achieve much notoriety until the 1950s, when the first major publishers started publishing science fiction in hardback form and in paperback, which became kind of the replacement for the pulp magazines. So it was a gradual growth. I can remember in the late 1950s, there were like 6 science fiction magazines being published and maybe 6 paperback science fiction books a month. And Mark, what did you tell me? How many books were published under the science fiction label last year?
Last year, about 1,400 new titles.
So it's literally exploded in terms of its popularity in my lifetime. And now we have many things that have happened within the field, which we can talk about in terms of themes and what's popular now, and the really revolutionary things that have happened in terms of who is writing science fiction now and what is selling and what's popular. So let's delve into that a little bit.
Oh, wow. You and I are both of an age that we remember when it was almost entirely a white man's field. And right now, the Hugo ballot has been released for books from last year. And 90% of the nominees are women. A good chunk of them are women of color. This is amazing because not only socially, but the work that is being honored is phenomenal. The perspectives being brought to the field are unique, or perhaps not unique in themselves, but unique as being present in science fiction. And it's just making the work extraordinary. And this is something that I don't think we might have wished for it, but didn't expect it. And it's just sort of come as a tidal wave. It's amazing.
Right. I commented to Mark earlier today that there's a lot of controversy within the field today, a lot of upset people that there are all these women having all this success, and the sad puppies, I believe they're known collectively as, and they want the good old days when only men were writing it, and it was red-blooded science fiction, and so you certainly see that within the field. So it's
The rockets and ray guns crowd.
right.
That red-blooded, techno-centered science fiction of yesteryear.
Right.
And now we have all this sociological stuff that's like,
And it's interesting, we have a much more international scope now in terms of what is being published and what's popular in science fiction, which you just wouldn't have had. I mean, I guess the Stragosky brothers would have been an example, and
Strugatsky,
Stanislaw
Lem,
Lem, perhaps back in earlier
Yeah.
days. But now you have Chinese science fiction authors who are on the bestseller lists.
And Korea is now
And
being
Korea.
introduced. In fact, I think there's a new miniseries on, or is it a movie, on Netflix, The Space Sweepers, which is a Korean science fiction.
Right.
And it's got some extraordinary production values and some really interesting premises. It's
Well, that's the media part of it is a whole other bottle, whole other barrel of fish, so to speak, because
Yeah.
again, that's something that has exploded in terms of popularity. When we were growing up, going to the movies, how many science fiction movies or quote superhero movies, how popular were they? Not very, Science fiction movies were typically B movies, The Creatures, my favorite, Invasion of the Saucer Men, where the saucer men they had alcohol in their blood instead of blood, and they would inject the teenagers with alcohol, and they'd come home and they were drunk and they couldn't explain to mommy and daddy why they were drunk. It was really those flying saucer.
those aliens.
It was those aliens. That was kind of like what the science fiction films were like growing up as a child.
And occasionally you'd get a gem, like The Day the Earth Stood Still or Forbidden
Or
Planet.
Forbidden Planet, sure. But, typically were just unable to recreate on the screen what was being written about in the books. And now that's not an impediment.
Yeah, it's not an impediment.
Impediment, thank you. That's the word.
So, yeah, currently in the field, well, the other interesting thing is how it has crept into what has traditionally been known as mainstream. You've got an awful lot of writers that are writing literary fiction with science fiction elements, and sometimes it's outright science fiction. Kazuo Ishigura's new novel, The Sun and Clara and the Sun, I believe it's called.
Don't know it, yeah.
Just came out. It is a science fiction novel. It's unapologetically so, but he is not marketed as a science fiction writer. And nobody's questioning his choice of subject matter. A few years ago,
That would have been unheard of.
Emily St. John Mandel published a book called Station 11, which is a post-apocalyptic novel dealing with a super flu, and 90% of the population of the globe dies. And it is about the recovery, and it centers on a traveling theater group that's doing Shakespeare in the rural hinterlands, trying to preserve civilization. It's solid. It is first-rate science fiction.
But it wasn't published as
It wasn't published as science fiction because she doesn't write science fiction. And of course, the great one was when Margaret Atwood started writing science fiction. And when Handmaid's Tale came out, she vociferously denied that it was science fiction. Now she accepts it
Right.
because it doesn't impact her bottom line. I don't think she ever cared, but the publisher said, don't call it science fiction because we'll lose customers. Well, that's not happening anymore. People want it. It's just become normal. I mean, after all, this is the Star Trek generation that has grown up and is now writing contemporary fiction. And it's going to be in there. And after all, we live in a world that's been shaped by a lot of these ideas for the last 60, 70 years.
Right.
And we actually have a lot of the stuff and live with it now. So it doesn't feel like science fiction anymore.
Right.
But the implications and the impact of it on society are clearly what was the meat and gristle of good science fiction back in the 40s and 50s and 60s.
Well, William Gibson's favorite or famous quote, the future is here, but it's just
unequally distributed.
Distributed, yes. So
So
the whole concept of genre has basically just kind of, it hasn't evaporated, but it's kind of lots of time travel stories out there that are romances too. And so as Mark suggests, mainstream writers have borrowed basically science fiction ideas, especially alternate history.
Oh, yeah.
What was his book about Lindbergh?
Oh, Lindbergh became president.
Lindbergh became president.
Yeah.
That was
The Plot Against America.
The Plot Against America, right, which was strictly alternative history, would have been stuck in the science fiction label had it not been that particular author. So it's a changing field, and I mentioned earlier, I'm totally unable to keep up today with what's currently being produced because there's just so much of it.
Yeah, well, don't feel bad. I write the stuff and I can't even scratch the surface. My exposure to it is, I work at a bookstore, Left Bank Books, St. Louis. And if it weren't for that, I would be unaware of quite a bit of it because there's just not enough time and certainly not enough shelf space. So I'm seeing these things come in and dipping into them. And I'm like, okay, this is the kind of stuff that we always wanted to see written. And we are seeing it written in a way that we always wished we could do. And of course, we've always had our literary lights. I mean, you know, Gene Wolfe and Samuel R. Delany and Ursula Le Guin. I would compare their prose to anybody's of any genre in terms of quality and depth. But for a long time, they were the exceptions. That wasn't what the field was about. And now it seems like the lessons have been learned and internalized, and the writers are just writing about this stuff as if it's the air they breathe, and they're paying attention to the quality of the story on equal terms with the ideas. And
Right.
It's producing some marvelous things.
Whereas in the past, a lot of science fiction, while the ideas may have been sterling, the actual prose and the execution may not have been
Yeah, I mean,
as well executed.
but you don't know that until you've lived another 20 or 30 years, and then you go back and reread them. And then you kind of go, oh, yeah.
That is true. Now, I had an interesting experience recently. I read a Captain Future novel by Alan Steele, our friend Alan.
Yeah.
And was thinking of Edmund Hamilton, great pulp author of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I pulled out a book from the shelf that I had read as a teenager and just loved, City on the Edge. No, I can't remember the name of it now. But at any rate, I was astonished at how good a writer Edmund Hamilton was, because I had just had this memory of him being this world crasher, Edmund Hamilton, and it was just going to be silly stuff. And actually, it was rather nice.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure when you run into that.
Yeah, but sometimes you'll run into things that
like, why did I even pick this back up? Yeah,
right.
But that can be true of any genre.
Yeah.
Part of the handicap that science fiction had in days gone by is that we were making things up out of whole cloth. We were extrapolating scenarios that didn't exist, so you couldn't rely on the reader's experience of that world to fill in the gaps. You could read any other genre, and we were talking about the real world. People know that. We don't have to go to the lengths that we go in science fiction to explain what's going on. We could just say it was here and move, and everybody knew what you were talking about. So yeah, occasionally you'd run into something that was like the comedian trying to explain the joke. But the best of the field, and I mentioned Ursula Le Guin a couple of years ago, I read The Left Hand of Darkness for the first time, which to my embarrassment, that was a classic that I should have read when I was in high school.
Yeah, that is a classic.
And it is one of the most beautifully written novels I've ever read. It's just gorgeous. That is becoming the bar now. And as much the subject matter as anything else. I would recommend a new writer named Becky Chambers. She is writing a series of novels in what we would call a mosaic universe, which, if you don't know what that is, essentially it is a background universe where you can set stories that do not have the same characters. You can move around in that universe and tell a story over here or over here, and the universe remains the same, but the characters and the stories are all over the place. And she's constructing one where, in essence, these are family sagas and the sagas of settlers and people on the frontier, and she's going into the interior. She's talking about them as real people, and the focus of the story is on their personal lives, experiencing life in this milieu. And they're all good. And the last one that she did, she has a new one coming out, but the last one she did, Record of a Spaceborne Few, is absolutely astonishing. Not much happens, but the people are the most memorable part. This has been going on, this has been an evolution of storytelling within the genre now for 40 years, 40 or 50 years. And it's coming to fruition now. And we're just seeing more and more of this stuff where we have accepted that tomorrow, not next year, not 10 years from now, not in the next century, but tomorrow is going to be different. And we're going to have to deal with that. And here's some of the tools that we need to deal with it.
Right.
And this is where a lot of us get our tools for dealing with anything, is from the stories we tell each other and from the fiction. And that's what the myths were. That's what fairy tales are. They're instruction manuals for how to deal with the unexpected and how to cope with life and its unexpected realities. And now we're seeing, and we have been seeing for a while, the bulk of science fiction is being directed in that way. That no, we know the change is going to come tomorrow. Here's what you need to know, and here are some possible tactics for dealing with it.
Yes.
And it's just an extraordinary field to be. I envy anybody who's 12 years old discovering it for the first time right now. This is going to be huge.
Yeah, there's an extraordinary amount of material out there.
Yeah.
That's been produced already and is being produced even as we speak. So, yeah, it's a great time to be a science fiction reader for sure. And of course, we haven't even touched on fantasy, which is kind of science fiction's what? Illegitimate. I didn't say that, did I?
Oh dear. Do we have to?
But that's also kind of gone in terms of the popularity, certainly with Tolkien and all that. That has certainly been part of the rise of the popularity of just fantastic fiction, the fiction of the imagination. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, have been a number of writers in the past several decades who've tried to distinguish themselves from category genre writers, and one of the terms that they'd use is fantasist.
Right.
Where just about anything that they write is not here, not now, not this realm. And it includes some aspects that cannot be here, cannot be now. Ray Bradbury, I think, this came up the other day. I was reading somebody's blog about this, and he had a love-hate relationship with Ray Bradbury. And this is one of the things that he always resented was Bantam's promotion of him as being the world's greatest science fiction writer. Ray Bradbury was many things, but not a science fiction writer. I think he wrote maybe a dozen science fiction short stories and one novel that's qualifiedly science fiction.
Fahrenheit.
But he was a superior fantasist.
Yeah.
And so it was a bit of a misnomer. And of course, the famous one is Harlan Ellison, who would very angrily assert that he is not a science fiction writer.
Right.
And quite accurately so, but you can understand the misperception because it had all been lumped into one category for so long.
Right.
I actually have a set of the original paperbacks that were first published in the United States of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And it says on the spine, science fiction. Ace basically pirated them.
Right.
And put them out, and it was science fiction. They did that to whomever they published. Avram Davidson.
Spider Kiss, Harlan Ellison, science fiction.
Science fiction.
It wasn't at all.
Avram Davidson got labeled a science fiction writer.
But writers resented being labeled as science fiction writers because that was considered to be
that weird stuff.
That weird stuff that nobody read, and they judged it in our day by the lurid covers of the pulp science fiction magazines, which always involved a bug-eyed monster a scantily clad young lady
Yeah.
being menaced by said monster, and then a
For
stalwart
reasons that
hero
are
with his
beyond
ray gun.
comprehension.
Well, yeah, yeah.
I think it was Lynn Carter in the 60s that finally successfully split the genres, because he started insisting that this is fantasy and this is science fiction and we should publish them separately because they're different markets.
Oh,
Lynn
what,
Carter.
you think it was Lynn Carter? Who was he editing?
He
at
was
that time?
at Ace at the time.
Was he? Okay.
Or
Wow.
Ballantine, I'm sorry. He was at
Yeah, he was
at
a bit
Ballantine.
Yeah. he would have been.
Um,
Well, Judy
Judy
Del
Lindell.
Rey and Judy, they would have been big into the publishing then.
They would, but by then it had already successfully
Yes,
been
yeah.
teased apart.
Yeah.
But even contemporary fantasy has taken a sea change. There are still a lot of sword and sorcery and, epic Conan-esque and Lord of the Rings ripoffs, but we're starting to see a lot what they used to call urban fantasy,
Right.
where the setting and the direction are completely not on that epic scale. And they're talking about myth and fairy tale
And magic.
in ways that
Yeah.
don't require a medieval setting or the open forest or anything like that. China Mayville had done some extraordinary stuff in that regard. Perdido Street Station
that's an amazing
is
book,
an
right?
amazing
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
And
The
it's
City in the City is another.
The City in the City is another.
They're great.
Great stuff. And the things that are being translated and published now from China are Saijin Liu is probably the biggest science fiction writer in China, and he's finally making inroads here. And The Three-Body Problem was the first book that came out from him, and it was the first of a trilogy. And reading it was surreal. It was cutting edge science fiction, dealt with an alien invasion. It was a slow invasion because it was going to take them a long time to get here, but they are preparing the ground in advance and messing with our ability to believe in our science. Gee, sound familiar? But there's a character running around in it that is straight out of a Mickey Spillane novel. There's a police sergeant who's got the pork pie hat and the Popeye Doyle attitude, and that's jammed in there. And there are a couple other things that feel like they've been borrowed from other cultures and shoved together in this, and it works. It's astonishing. It works, and it's huge and fascinating. And of course, we were favored with an excellent translator, Ken Liu, who's an American SF and fantasy writer, whose work I can recommend, has been doing the translations of a number of Chinese authors now, and he's a superb translator. This stuff is just expanding the parameters. And just in case anybody's worried, there's still space opera.
Right.
Anne Leckie's ancillary universe is wonderful. Marina Lostetter is doing, she just published the third book of her trilogy called Numenon. It's about the first interstellar missions and what they find out there. And it involves generation ship politics, AIs, and deceitful aliens, but they're not deceitful for the reasons that we might assume. Oh, heavens, what else is there?
Murderbot.
Murderbot, yes, Martha Wells.
Martha Wells, yes.
Who has, up to this point, up to a few years ago, mainly written fantasy, turned to science fiction and created this character that is just so much fun and puts you in all kinds of situations where the ethics, situational ethics,
Correct.
are front and center. You have the cybernetic unit, who's a security agent. He's supposed to be controlled
By the
internally
corporations.
by the corporation, and he has hacked his governor module. So he is actually free, but he doesn't tell anybody. He still does his job. But with his newfound freedom, what does he do? He downloads hundreds of hours of media so that he can sort of fade into the background at odd moments when he's not being useful and watch TV shows.
So he can figure out what it's like to be human, I
Yeah,
guess. And
something
what
like
is
that.
normal human behavior.
And he is forced to do his job because these silly, stupid humans keep doing things that they shouldn't do. You tell them to don't go there, they open the door and go there, and he has to go and get them. They are amazing. The first 4 Murderbot stories were novellas, and this past year, the first full-length novel was published.
And the new one is coming out this
And the
month.
new novella is coming out this month.
It's a novel, it's not a novella, but it's a book, it's a big book.
It's out. It's been
Is it out?
It's on the
The
Hugo
second one?
Gallery. It came out.
Oh, the second one is out?
Network Effect.
Yeah, okay. No, that's the first one. There's a new one, there's an even newer one.
There's
that's
an even
coming out.
newer
Yeah.
one coming. I thought that
Yeah,
was going to be.
there's a new one
another
that's publishing this month.
Keeping up is a full-time
Yeah,
job.
like we said earlier, it's a little tough. But yeah, you get to, in the Murderbot series, you get to look at the human race through the eyes of, quote, an alien or something
Yeah.
else, and it is quite amusing.
Yeah.
And then we can also speak of kind of the melding of mystery and science fiction, which has happened in the past. And the genres are similar in terms of, I guess, readership to a degree. I certainly will read an occasional mystery, but and enjoy it.
They're both, in a sense, problem-solving works, genres, where you have something to figure out. Instead of a whodunit, it's a what is it in science fiction. To oversimplify it. I tend to write from the standpoint of solving a mystery when I write. I set up a situation, what's going to happen next, and what is this all about? I find it, when I actually turn to mystery, the same muscles are being used.
Right, but as you suggested earlier, the mystery writer has a slightly easier task because he doesn't have to create the
He's dealing
whole
with the given,
world
yeah, he's dealing with the
and
given
make it
world.
real for the reader, that he doesn't have to have that extra step
Yeah.
that the science fiction writer, which is, I think, often thought the hardest
Yeah.
fiction to write, just for that reason that you
Yeah.
have to create that.
And while there have been a lot of science fiction writers who have then turned their hand to mystery, one of the most famous, of course, is Anthony Boucher.
Sure.
One of the first editors of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, was a even more prolific mystery author. And in fact, the
And his
major annual convention for mystery authors is named BoucherCon.
Boucher, yeah. And his pseudonym was H.H. Holmes.
Yeah,
And if you know
Yeah.
who H.H. Holmes was, you'll cringe.
yeah,
He was
Yeah.
the mass murderer at the Chicago World's Fair who designed that house. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that was horrible. It was just
yeah.
nasty. But
But I don't see that, from time to time, you'll see a mystery author turn his hand to science fiction today. And I always like the results, but then it's like, okay, I'm done with that. I'm going to go back to what I'm comfortable with now.
well, John D. MacDonald, when he started,
He was a science fiction writer.
He started with science fiction and did them both. And
Yeah.
then the mystery sold better, I think.
Yeah.
So
The British mystery author, who's unfortunately gone now, Philip Kerr, he wrote a series of historical mysteries, the Bernie Gunther novels,
Mhm.
which was about an ex-Gestapo officer who is trying to survive in the post-World War II world. Wrote one science fiction novel called Philosophical Investigation. And it was very, very good. No, he wrote 2. I didn't read the second one, but that one, it was extraordinary. The barriers between the genres are beginning to break down, even while publishing insists on maintaining the categories.
the publishers like the category.
They like the categories. I think a lot of readers, I don't mind categories on the spines because I do like to know where to go find what it is I'm specifically looking for. But I don't like them when they pigeonhole writers and readers and try to keep them apart. And I think it's getting somewhat easier for writers to write whatever they want. but that may be a function of the boundaries coming down within the genres themselves. How can you tell what it is this person is writing now? Is this in fact science fiction or not? John Crowley has written a number of mainstream novels, but if you squint, some of them are clearly SF novels. Lord Byron's novel it's an alternate history. It's mainstream as you can get, but it's alternate history.
Again, the blending of the genres, and that's certainly something we've seen in science fiction here.
Another Jennifer Ophel, Helen Phillips, those are two mainstream writers that essentially write SF. But it's very light. You have to kind of dig for it to see, oh no, this is actually science fiction. But it's all in service to talking about people in a changing and malleable world.
Right.
You know, you can't rely on the world being the same from one month to the next anymore. So the stories are beginning to reflect that
change
reality.
is the only constant that
Change
we
is the
live
only
in.
constant.
Yeah, and so that's why science fiction, I think, is valuable in that it does prepare you mentally to a degree for the possibility of change and then in the impacts of that change that may affect your life.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite. There was when did this come out? When did Future Shock come out? Is that the late 60s or the
Toffler,
that's
when was that? Yeah,
it was
60s.
at least the early 70s, but I think it was the late 60s.
I think 68 maybe.
Future Shock was the first bestseller that was trying to predict what the next century was going to actually be like. It was nonfiction speculation. And Future Shock, the term was described a condition where people were so flummoxed by the changes that they didn't know what to do.
Right.
That they were experiencing future shock. And there's one of my favorite quotes is from that book that people who read science fiction will have an easier time with future shock because they will have learned the anticipation of change.
Okay, I like that. Yeah.
I think the Star Trek generation is having an easier time with some of the social changes that are happening now than people who.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I would tend to agree with you. They tend to be more open to multicultural concerns and I mean, if you're dealing with an alien, a human skin color isn't probably going to make a lot of difference to you, really. It becomes less of a thing.
Yeah. So go forth, go read. If you really want, I can recommend Tor.com, which is a subdivision of Tor Books, primarily publishes standalone novellas. It's an excellent line of books, and I can recommend that if you just want a good smattering of what to look forward in the rest of the field, you just go find some Tor.com novellas by anybody. They are really, really good, and they're short. They don't take a lot of time to read. I'm reading one right now by Greg Egan, who's an Australian hard SF writer. Quite good. The Murderbot books that we mentioned came out originally as Tor.com novellas. That's a good way to sample it. The magazines are still out there, although the poor things are struggling for subscriptions. Analog is still a going thing. The Asimov's SF, the magazine of science fiction and fantasy, which just got a new editor, Sherry Renee Thomas, who's an African-American editor and writer, and she has a collection of short stories out called 9 Bar Blues. And as a musician, you will 9 Bar Blues.
Okay, well, that would be interesting. What time signature is that?
For what?
Yeah. There you go.
So it's going to be very interesting to see what she does with them. And now, magazine fantasy and science fiction has always had somewhat unusual editors and editorial policies. They were going they were founded to do more literary work
Correct.
in the first place. Boucher and McComas, that was their whole thrust was, there's no reason for this stuff to be
Right.
bad. And we're
Poorly written.
Poorly written.
Yeah.
So we're going to publish, and FNSF has published horror stories and fantasy and science fiction and alternate history and what have you, and all the stuff in between, as if it were all the same thing.
Right.
And it's a wonderful magazine, and they've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 editors now
Total.
since they were founded in 1949.
Right.
And the quality has always been amazing. So now,
Yeah, they originally appeared as the Magazine of Fantasy.
yeah,
That was the
it.
first volume, #1 was that. And the edit science fiction.
So
was-
now it's going to be interesting to see what Sherry does with it and how that's going to have an impact on the field. Because even if they have low subscriptions, these magazines still have a huge impact on the directions of the field. That's where the magazines are the test beds for
Right.
new ideas and new voices. And
So-
there's a lot of magazines on the web. Online magazines have proliferated like
Yes.
mushrooms after a spring rain. And it's solid work, and they're being recognized now with award nominations as well as everybody else. It is a brave new world.
It is, and there's certainly no lack of opportunity to sample what's out there. I'd also recommend it for just old-time science fiction, The Expanse, which is a series of novels that's also been turned into a television series, which is also quite good. But that's kind of old-fashioned space opera, but interplanetary space
Yeah.
opera as opposed to interstellar space opera, and a little more rationalized. They give you something.
It's pretty solid, yeah.
The physics is there, and it's real, and it's
Yeah, they're doing their due diligence in that.
Right,
To keep
we
it
had
close
an
to.
opportunity at Mark's bookstore to meet the authors, and it's 2 guys who write those things, and they were
Yeah.
both very, very sharp individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And my son over here asked one of them what the underlying theme of tell him, Nathan, what they said.
Yeah, I asked them 2 questions because I know this is also common with authorship where people insert their own agendas into the author's work. And so I asked is like, okay, so what are the themes people see in your work? And what was the theme you were intentionally writing? And they responded, well, people have put anything and everything you can imagine projected onto it. But the core theme was tribalism is bad.
Yeah.
And so it's essentially about a cast of characters, and it is an interplanetary system story. So it has people from Earth, people from Mars, and people from the asteroid belt. And those are the 3 major cultures. But in the setting, everybody hates each other. The Belters hate the Martians and the Earthers. The Earthers hate the Martians and the Belters. The Martians hate the Earthers. Anyway, but the core story is about a crew that's a mixed crew, where there are people from Earth, there are people from Mars. And
They're Belters.
And they're the champions that wind up solving or being involved with most of the major problems as the thing evolves. And all the problems are solved through cooperation between the 3 major parties. And so it's definitely taking a look at racism, tribalism, religion, and all of these things. And essentially that's the core theme over and over again, is when people get tribal and start competing for resources, that's when things all go bad. Or trying to get one up on the other group, that's when things fall apart. And I think it's a true lesson that we are experiencing over and over throughout history, but yet again,
Yeah,
very contemporary.
tribalism is bad.
Tribalism.
Which you go back, oh God. You go back to the 30s and you can find that theme in science fiction running all the way through. Because it was an outward looking genre and we were anxious to meet the alien, and all the problems are going to result from the fear of the other, which pops up repeatedly here and there. And I think finally now is coming to the fore as the major theme, because if we are in fact going to meet the aliens, we had better get our own house in order in terms of that kind of categorizing people and putting them in boxes and then institutionally hating them. And that's been a theme in SF since I can remember.
Let's speak briefly of how themes in science fiction have changed through the years and how there have been certain things that have been popular, like let's say the 30s would have been space opera. And the 40s would have been the introduction maybe of a little sociology and a little more naturalism. And then the 50s we get the ESP, that was big.
That was big, yeah.
Telepathy, telekinesis and so forth.
And then in the 60s, you got a huge dollop of sociology.
Right.
But you can start with the two major movements in science fiction that from say, from the point that Hugo Gernsback started his magazine in 1926, Amazing Stories, the first phase was, look at all the neat toys.
Exactly. Ralph 124C41
We
plus.
can
television.
look at all the neat toys and what we can do, et cetera, et cetera. And then after that all got cleared away and people like John Campbell came on the scene, it was essentially colonialism.
Right.
We're going to go out and find new worlds, and we're going to settle these worlds, and pity the poor aliens if they get in our way, et cetera. And now phase two, which started a little bit in the 60s and now has emerged as a major theme, is the cost of colonialism and anti-colonialism.
Right.
And I'm pleased to say that some of the most strident voices are in fact from the traditional font of science fiction, the West. But we're also getting a lot of SF from South Africa and from China and from places and India that have experienced colonialism firsthand. And that's all adding in to say, the only problem with Star Trek, the prime directive, isn't really a solution. Let's go find them so we can leave them alone. And people who have been the victims of colonialism know that that's never how that works. Once they find you, they won't leave you alone.
That's right.
So there's the two major themes that have informed much of it. And then you can subdivide into the minor themes. The 60s, the so-called New Wave, was a big major eruption in the field where you had a lot of writers that said, we are tired of writing about spaceships, robots, and ray guns. I want to write about politics. I want to write, and it was brought to my attention recently by Chip Delaney that the New Wave was essentially political. That the entire thrust of it was to rattle the cage of received political wisdom.
Which it did rather well.
Some of it did it rather strangely. And some of it was atrocious because they were trying any old thing to break the boundaries. And some of it was just unintelligible. But by and large, the stuff that survived and the writers that continued on into the 70s were making science fiction overtly, because it had always been in some sense political. You can't talk about change without it being somewhat political.
Correct.
But they were making it overtly political. And you get stuff in the 60s and 70s, like Harry Harrison's Make Room, Make Room.
Soylent Green.
Or Soylent Green.
In the movie version, yeah.
Or later, the stuff that Fred Pohl wrote, which was all tongue-in-cheek jabs at political inertia. And it got really, really interesting by the 80s when the cyberpunks came in.
Right.
And they were the ones that said, you think you've seen some interesting politics so far? You ain't seen nothing. Wait till the information age rocks your world.
Right.
We mentioned William Gibson earlier, and his one great quote, "The future is here, it's just unequally distributed." And he is still a profoundly relevant writer.
He is indeed.
Just keeps talking about how systems collide, and his new trilogy, I'm assuming it's going to be a trilogy because he's written nothing but trilogies,
Right, yeah.
starting with The Peripheral, which is, okay, this is my recommend. The Peripheral is one of the 3 best time travel novels ever written. And while it's being a fabulous time travel novel, it is disassembling economies and
Exactly.
social structures and the whole idea behind imperialist economics.
And Gibson is the guy who has said that in science fiction, he likes to be actually start reading a story and have absolutely no idea what's going on. No references at all. And he has to, the point for him is the voyage of discovery, of figuring out what this world, and certainly that book is a prime example of that, because if you open that up and read the first chapter, you have no idea what is going on. But through the clues and through his, you start to figure out, and it is a compelling story. And I would agree, it's one of the better time travel stories I've ever read.
So what we're dealing with now as a major theme, I think, is the proper approach to multiculturalism. Aliens have finally taken their, I mean, they have from time to time before, but aliens have finally taken their place as just us.
Right.
And, you know, the famous Campbellian problem, which a lot of writers had problems with John W. Campbell, was his injunction that you can have aliens in your story, but they are either going to be technologically superior, but not morally superior, or they can be morally superior, but technologically inferior to humans.
That was Campbell.
You cannot have them both ways. And a lot of writers said, well, that's, Asimov's response was to stop writing about aliens. He, you know, there's a handful of short stories where there are aliens, and then all of a sudden they disappear in Asimov.
That's right. I hadn't forgotten about that, or thought about that. Yeah.
They just disappeared. Well, a lot of writers rebelled and said, no, this is nonsense. But there was always kind of a competitive, who's going to be better edge to a lot of it. Now I think it's finally, we're going to all have to live in this universe together. So let's just explore those parts of commonality that we can find. And if we can't find commonality, then we'll have to create it. And the stories that are not that positive show the dire consequences of failing to find that commonality. There's you can still find the other stuff. I mean, it's you know, the hip hooray, we're the human race, we're going to go out and be better than everybody else. You can still find those. That has not dried up at all.
Any Bain book.
But the best stuff, the in terms of quality and challenge and the richness of ideas, this is where the action is. What is our place in a broader universe, and what represents ethical behavior across species? And what are we going to do with our ability to change and adapt? Wow, did I just say all that?
You did. And of course, we would like to make the point that science fiction is really always about the present. It's just people responding to the present and then projecting oftentimes their own fears or their own hopes or whatever however it has struck them. So you'll find, like in the 50s, there were novels like, I'm thinking Heinlein's Puppet Masters, which was just kind of the big Red Scare, the communist, you know, that was certainly on his mind then. So yeah, science fiction is always about the present, but it's just projected.
So
how are we doing?
We got about, you know, it's 7:45. We should open the floor to some questions.
I'd like to ask about an old definition of science fiction versus fantasy. They used to say that science fiction more closely adhered to known scientific laws, whereas fantasy didn't pay much attention to scientific laws. Could you comment on that?
Well,
That is a poor way of putting it, because really, if you think about it, almost no science fiction novel has ever adhered closely to actual science. I think we were saddled with an unfortunate label that raised those expectations. But having said that, if you look at science not as a set of answers and solutions, but as a way of looking at the world, then it fits. Science fiction took that perspective and said, let's write stories which center in that method. So you could talk about faster than light travel, which, you know, in spite of the speculation we all know is the equivalent of a magic carpet. But you can use it to talk about the universe in ways that adhere to the way in which science looks at the universe. Fantasy doesn't care about knowing things hardly at all. Fantasy is about innate essence. It's about reification of certain virtues. It's about confronting evil in a big way with a big sword. And I'm oversimplifying, but science fiction is about learning how to unravel the universe and the reasons for doing so. So the way I like to put it is that science fiction is essentially epistemological fiction. Epistemology being that branch of philosophy that's involved with how we know things. And fantasy could care less. I say it that way, but that doesn't take anything away from fantasy in terms of a literary mode. If that's the thing that you're looking for, fantasy to me is essentially historical fiction. Good fantasy is essentially historical fiction with somewhat added fantastic element. And you can get all kinds of good stuff out of it. Fantasy could be really good about discussing politics in a certain way, but it doesn't really care about understanding the universe. And in that sense, I think the difference couldn't be more stark between the two genres. They are for different purposes. And by the way, that also lets writers off the hook when they get the science wrong. Because and I put it to you that getting the science wrong does not change a novel or a story from science fiction to something else, because we can go back and read Arthur C. Clarke, who was in his day one of the epitomes of a hard SF writer.
Right.
And the science has changed. There are mistakes. It's wrong, but we still read it as science fiction because of the mindset and the way he approached the story.
Right.
Now, I do think, now isn't that the way?
William Anscoff's son.
Isn't that the way science fiction was once kind of classified as hard? Science fiction is the stuff that is more tied to what we currently know.
Yeah.
And speculating from there, while soft
Yeah.
is the one that's more likely to take more liberty with the physics or the chemistry or the
Yeah.
biology.
Yeah, I kind of look at it as that the hard SF was the stuff where a significant part of the story was directly involved with the physics. And that was part of the narrative structure, was learning the physics. And the other stuff took it as given, and we're not interested in that as part of the story. It doesn't mean that the physics were any less accurate in the soft stuff, but it wasn't front and center as part of the narrative flow. So to me, that distinction is more stylistic than I mean, you know, after all, there's been some hard SF stuff. If you go back far enough, George O. Smith's Venus Equilateral stuff was about as hard SF as you could get in the 40s and 50s.
40s, yeah.
And even then, he'd made some egregious mistakes in calculation abilities, and the numbers didn't add up in some of his stories.
Well,
But
what
you-
is it in the first edition of Ringworld? Larry Niven had
Larry
the world,
Niven had the world going in the wrong
in
direction.
the wrong direction. Oh, well,
Yeah,
details.
because he had these jump gates, you could basically teleportation platforms. The guy was Louis Wu, the main character, it's his birthday, and he's trying to extend it by chasing the sun. And when you read the first edition, if you can find it, he's going the wrong way. And he realized that, oh, I got the earth revolving in the wrong direction.
They corrected it in the subsequent editions.
Yeah, but that still didn't make it fantasy. I mean,
No.
you know, the errors don't change it to a different form.
True that. So,
In terms of sales, like at your store, science fiction, has it grown a lot too? I mean, I know mystery is such a huge genre. I mean, in terms of readership, at our library, mysteries probably are.
I think that science fiction reached a peak of sales about 15 years ago and has leveled off and now stagnated. And the more I look at that, the more I think it's because there are writers who are writing SF that's not marketed as SF. And if you could somehow figure out how to add them into it, it would be about 20 to 25% of all book sales. When you throw fantasy into it, it goes up to about 30%. There was a short period of time in the late 80s when fantasy and science fiction beat romance
in terms of titles.
In terms of total sales and market share.
Yeah.
And I think at that time it was just slightly over 30%.
When is this? When?
Back in the late 80s.
Oh.
We had a huge boom in the late 70s and early 80s because of both Star Trek and Star Wars.
Right.
Those two things dragged a huge number of people into the field, and books just, for the first time, the dream of many an author, they were getting six-figure advances for their, and like, oh my God, this is great. And then it gradually leveled off because that audience,
They are still selling. I noticed that. I just recently acquired the Murderbot series we've been talking about. That's in an 8th printing already in the copies I bought. So
yeah, they're flying off the shelves.
They're flying off the shelves. They're selling some books.
Yeah. But with so many books being published, and it's down, the number of books in science fiction has dropped. We're about 12 to 17% down from its peak 5 or 6 years ago. But this is part of the entire publishing industry, I think, is the whole thing is starting to drop. But there's so many books being published, it's very hard to track.
What about the effects of ebooks in science fiction?
About 3 years ago, I 3 or 4 years ago, I looked at that because we were trying to sell ebooks through the store, and they'd come up and then they would just get stuck. And I think the industry realized that ebooks have a very limited market. It might be generational, but they just plateaued very quickly and stayed. They don't drop, they don't go up.
Yeah, so the predictions of the death of the actual physical book were premature.
Yeah, as it turns out, the most ardent technophiles want paper when they're reading for pleasure.
Me too.
Well, there are also cognitive science reasons for that. They've done studies on screen backlit reading versus print reading, and we retain better from print.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to read something and internalize it, and it's something, and this is, or I could be misquoted because it's been a while since I've read the research, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 words. So that's about all you can retain digitally. Beyond that, it just becomes very nebulous. So backlit screen reading is very good for quick browsing or looking a topic up or getting a quick answer. But so far as sitting down and getting into a research paper or a real book or a novel, print is still the way to go. And this is why a lot of the e-readers spent a lot of time trying to develop liquid paper technologies. Where they wanted to have a digital interface that resembled the printed word as much as possible. We don't have a hard science reason as to why. The speculation is because it's backlit, there's something that happens at the subconscious level that makes it seem less permanent.
There was a
versus
prototype.
light off the paper.
There was a DARPA prototype about 20 years ago for a paper book that was downloadable. You'd have a USB port at the spine of the book, blank pages, you'd plug the book in and the book would populate with the text.
They already did that in Pleasantville.
That's
So,
yeah.
The movie.
They actually developed an actual one that did that.
But having smart
paper if,
Very expensive.
yeah,
Uh,
but, you know,
Audiobooks do better than ebooks.
in terms of
yeah,
the
Yeah,
sales.
in terms of sales, yeah. Because people are on the road a lot and they're portable listening devices. They'll go for a jog, they'll listen to a book.
but it's also very, it's the tactile thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when you're reading a book and or a manuscript, whatever, and then it's easy, it's much easier to remember the location of what you just read
yeah,
on the page, and even if you can't remember exactly, you know, if it was 20 or 30 pages ago, and then you can kind of remember if it
Easily
was
go
on
back,
the
yeah.
right
yeah,
or left side, and, you know, was it towards the bottom of the page, and that's how I was reading books, and I've read books like all my life, but.
Yeah.
You know, going back and he did it on the iPad and everything else. You can't flip it back 20 pages.
Yeah,
But you can, but it's a
Sorry.
pain.
it is.
It's,
It's a pain.
you know, but the advantage of the digital thing is, number one, you can make it any size of type you want. That's my number one plug for
Right.
Yeah.
electronic books. And number two is just, you know, and if you want to make it easier on your eyes, flip it. Black background, white type, oh my, it's wonderful.
Yeah,
So those are my two plugs.
Yeah, but it's
Electronic.
interesting. I didn't even know that you sold ebooks at the bookstore.
well, we don't anymore. I mean, we did for a while.
Yeah.
We sold the Kobo e-reader, and so you could subscribe to it through our website and buy the books from Kobo. And we were selling the readers, and it just ended up being, no, we're not, this isn't worth having.
More trouble than
More trouble than it's worth. So it was one of those, sounds great, and then in reality, it just, nobody likes it. Or few people like it.
What did I download? I think we did. I think that's when we were actually doing the book group on Moby Dick.
Oh, yeah, you
Or
tried,
was it,
no, you downloaded Moby Dick.
yeah.
That just, no.
I mean, it was like, no. I
You
mean,
need
in
it.
reality, and that, no, but it was like, okay, so we need a hard copy after all.
Yeah.
Well, an ebook is a science fiction concept in itself, isn't it?
It's a wonderful idea, because I didn't want to do the paper.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, well.
and then-
We
but
understand.
it's like,
So in terms of science fiction's future, where are we going with it?
Oh, gosh.
That's a good question. The future
That's a
of,
good question.
That's the future of science fiction.
That sounds like a science fiction story in itself.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
and one that's-
I have no idea because I couldn't have predicted where we're at now.
I
from
remember,
20 years ago.
remember Alex E. Panchin and his great short story collection, Farewell to Yesterday's Tomorrow?
Yeah.
That was,
About 30 years ago, I was on a panel and somebody asked the question of a bunch of us, who's going to be read in 50 years? And somebody threw out an author and everybody else, and after about 2 minutes of complete chaos, I said, we're going to be reading whoever's publishing in 50 years. Trying to predict who's going to still be read in 50 years. Did anybody think? And Moby Dick is a good example. According to all the metrics, that book should have sunk like a stone and left no trace because it was a complete and utter flop when it came out and nobody bothered with it for
Right.
50 years.
right.
And then they rediscovered it in the early 20th century and suddenly it's a must-read classic. Who could have predicted that?
Oh, wow.
So where's science fiction? the universe is always going to throw us a curveball. We are always going to have situations which will require innovative approaches of talking about science fiction. My communicator just alerted me. And since science fiction is always about the present, using the lens of the future as a distorting element to make it, to abstract the themes out of it, whatever's going on in 50 years, that's what they're going to be writing science fiction about.
That's what's going to be selling, but it is an interesting question to think what will be, because many of yesteryear's bestsellers are totally unknown today. Nobody reads those authors who were extremely popular at their time.
Yeah,
we can think of examples, but
it's,
but then who would have guessed that some things have survived that have? You know,
well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I noticed that some authors, we mentioned Asimov before. Del Rey is releasing a new edition of all of his fiction. They're very nice trade paperback editions. The Foundation trilogy is coming out. Of course, this is all in anticipation of the TV series that Apple is producing of the Foundation.
right.
But Isaac Asimov's nonfiction, which was by far and away the bulk of his production, is gone.
Right.
Nobody is reprinting any of his nonfiction, which is unfortunate because it was marvelous. It was amazing, but nobody's,
Right, you
give it
the
another
gamut.
20 years and nobody's going to know that he ever did write nonfiction.
That's right.
And out of 500 books, I think probably 450 of them were nonfiction.
Right.
So, that's the one thing that people who are not familiar with science fiction still tend to get wrong, that science fiction is not predictive fiction. We are not predicting the future.
That's correct.
We occasionally get lucky and predict some stuff that happens to come true. And there was, there's a writer named Charles Gannon. He writes a space opera series, but his PhD thesis was on science fiction of the 19th century and its ties to the military. And he unearthed all of these works of science fiction which were talking about these new weapons and these new tactics and all this new stuff. And he plotted how the military would read this stuff, or vice versa, and then try to build this stuff.
Sure.
And it was it would be considered a subgenre today, but it was a very healthy industry up until H.G. Wells came along and said, no, this is what science fiction is. And that kind of went by the wayside. We still see it. But it was almost a symbiotic relationship between, particularly in Britain, this was mostly in Britain, and a little bit in France and Germany. It was almost a symbiotic relationship between what were the equivalent of science fiction writers then and the military. And
I wasn't aware of that connection. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to see what happens. So science fiction suggests something. I mean, we're all talking about Star Trek now and all the stuff that Star Trek predicted. I think that's the wrong word. Star Trek put some stuff out there that might have been a good idea, and somebody said, I'm going to see if I can make that work. Now that's not quite prediction. Prediction assumes that what's going to happen happens without knowing that the prediction occurred. But if you prime the pump and somebody invents the thing, is that actually prediction, or is that just simply motivation?
What one man can imagine, another can create. That's
Yeah.
a Jules Verne quote. And walk to any store and the doors go like this. It's just like on the Enterprise. And you can bet that was inspired by Star Trek.
I mean, the first beepers used the sound from the communicators.
Right, from
on
Star Trek.
Yeah.
Yeah, and our handheld telephones are being used now as medical devices. And
Yeah, when I finally broke down and
scanners.
bought a smartphone, my mother says, well, what kind did you get? And I said, a tricorder. Oh, yeah, it's a phone as well. Look at all this other stuff it does.
Could you refresh my memory on what kind of nonfiction Asimov wrote?
Asimov wrote a regular column for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction for like 25 years that were all essays on scientific history and scientific ideas.
And they were reprinted by Doubleday
And they
quite dutifully.
Yeah, they were all
hardcover
collected together.
volumes.
And then he also wrote primers on physics. And he wrote a 2-volume set where he annotated Shakespeare. He wrote
He did that for the
He
Bible.
did that for the Bible.
The solar system, the atomic elements. I'm a retired librarian, so we had an awful lot of Asimov nonfiction in our collection. And so, he basically, from soup to nuts.
Yeah, he was a
basically.
workaholic and he was interested in everything. So he wrote about everything. I made a joke back in the day that if I had problems in high school with a subject, I found the book Asimov wrote on it and didn't have any problems anymore. And it was almost always true that you could find it. He did a book on biology. He did a book on how the brain works. He did a book on
Name a subject.
Yeah, name a subject.
He might have written the book about it.
He wrote a 2-volume autobiography, which then later he added to with a 3rd volume. He just, and to my mind, that was as much as I love Isaac Asimov, I think in terms of the public service that he did, that was far superior because he was the great explainer. He wrote in a very accessible style. He could break any subject down so that a sophomore in high school could understand the most arcane stuff. He was kind of incredible.
He was.
And he would write, I saw a picture of his office one time. He worked in an attic. He had it completely refinished and there was a table that ran the length of the attic and he had 8 IBMs lined up and each one had a different project. He'd get tired with one, he'd move to the next one and work on that. And he'd move to... So after he got up and running, it was just this constant word flow that kept just coming out.
Can you make a living writing science fiction? I noticed a gentleman over there works in a bookstore.
You can ask that question about any genre of writing. Can you make a living as a writer? No, you cannot. There are people who make livings at it, and there are some people who make exceptionally good livings at it. They distort the average, but I think a couple of years ago, the Writers Guild published that the average income of the average writer is about $5,500 a year.
And try living on that. Good luck, department.
You don't do this for the money.
If it comes,
If it comes, be grateful. You do this for love. Or because you're not very smart.
Christians and Pattersons out there, and then Pattersons, so,
Yeah, I mean, the Pattersons and the Kings distort the average, and they're very visible, and it makes people think. But I mean, I even had people who are in the field think that I was making big bucks when are you kidding? If you are really, really adaptable and you can write a broad range of things, you could possibly make a reasonable living at writing, but you have to write everything. If what you want to do is make your living as a fiction writer, writing a specific kind of thing, you've got to get lucky and have a work ethic like Sisyphus.
and you never want to do the price per hour.
Yeah, you never want to calculate your hourly wage. That will depress you more than anything else you've ever encountered.
If something takes you 3 years to write,
Yeah.
definitely don't want to do the math on that.
That said-
There are a few Twilight people, I mean,
Yes.
those are flukes, all those.
Yeah, and
That's
you
also
also,
multimedia tie-in.
there's
So if
media
your book gets
tie-ins, yeah,
optioned
I
and
mean,
turned into a movie that you get a percentage that's what sets. certain
Well, we
up
mentioned
there.
The Expanse before. Daniel Abraham, who's one half of that writing team, had been publishing novels for like 15, 20 years before they embarked on that, and he had to have a day job. I mean, basically, he wrote fantasy, but nevertheless, he'd been toiling in those fields for a long, long time, and he was getting his average advances, and he was never going to be able to quit the day job. And then they did this,
And it took
and
off.
it took off. And he admitted at that event at our bookstore that when they started writing this, essentially they just wanted pizza money. They thought they were going to be able to eat at a better restaurant when they got the royalty checks on this. And instead, you can't predict that. There's no way to know that that's going to happen. And
You do have to have some quality, something that is appealing to the audience
Yeah.
at that particular time.
Yeah.
And if you can conjure that magic and get those two things
Yeah.
to come
I
together.
mean, part of the problem is that the publishing world has changed so much since the days when a novelist could actually make a living at it, because they don't care anymore about nurturing writers. One of the finest science fiction writers that ever lived was Gene Wolfe. And for a fact, he would have vanished without a trace if he had not had a champion at a publishing house. And that was David Hartwell, who was going to go to the mat for Gene Wolfe no matter what. And eventually Gene Wolfe became a major thing. But without David Hartwell, that's doubtful that he would have become much more than anybody else who would publish 5 or 6 books and then disappear. Which is a shame. And certainly the quality was there in the work, but
Exposure and getting enough
exposure
readers.
and marketing and somebody who's just willing to back that pony through a number of books, that kind of environment doesn't exist anymore for the vast majority of people trying to write.
True that. Well, we should hold up
Well,
a copy of Mark's book. This is his latest publication.
We have a number of his books in our collection.
Can you
Gravity
tell us
Box.
your names again slowly?
Mark W. Tiedemann.
That's it.
W. Tiedemann.
And John Lowrance.
John Lowrance.
All right, thank you guys, really. It's been wonderful.
We're done.
Thank you for coming out.
Thanks for coming out. I appreciate it.
It's nice to see people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Isn't it though?
Yeah.
Real living, breathing people.